then Nadim just suggested, how about your own personal experiences with him? That is to say, well, everything I talk about is what I've seen, but there were a number of encounters that I had with him personally, which might be of interest too. And the first time I saw him, let me say this. When I finished my chemistry degree in the US, I was thinking of going on to do law. And I had enrolled in the Harvard Law School, so I was in a good place to go. And then the people of Opus Dei suggested, well, how would you like to go to Rome and do your theology there, fast-tracking it, because you do it full-time. And then you're there with the Father, as we call St. Josemaría. And I had not met the Father. Everybody asked about him when someone came from Rome or Europe, how is the Father? But he wasn't the father figure that he would later become. And my own dad had died when I was 16, and our father became really my father, and for lots of reasons of affection for me and this relationship with him, who was truly a father. But so then going to Rome was exciting, and then when you get to Rome, you want to meet him. Well, when I arrived in Rome, it was the end of August, and then we went down to Salto dei Fondi, which is an estate south of Rome on the Mediterranean. So it was cooler, and that's where we went to study in the summers. And so I was there studying and learning Spanish, which was the key thing. Then we went back to Rome, and I think we were back to Rome on the 1st of October of 1962. And then somebody was showing me around the gardens of the villa, and then we were just showing around, and then our father just happened to come out to the balcony of the rooms where he worked and lived in the central villa of Villa Teverde. And so I think we waved to him, and that was the first sight of him, just seeing him. And then the following day was the 2nd of October, so that's the founding of the work. And so of course we had a big get together with him. And then you see how he was, and you've seen him in films. And the things that impressed you, humanly speaking, and I've said this many times, including recently somewhere, he was the most affectionate, kind-hearted, good-humored person I'd ever met. And he just exuded affection. And it was this spiritual volcano pouring out the love of God in love of others. And so then we're in the get-together, and there was probably something over 100, 120 students like myself. Many of them new, just arrived. Others had been there for some time. And in this get-together in the Soggiorno degli Archi, they call it now, Soggiorno of the Arches, used to have a different name, but a lot of us sitting on the floor or sitting on chairs, and he was in a particular couch that he generally sat in. And then he looked at me at one stage, and he hadn't seen me before, but he looked at me and he said, "Tienes cara de pillo," so anybody that speaks Spanish, you have the face of a wise guy, can't remember, somebody translated, there's a nice translation, it's not wise guy, but it's somebody like that. Anyway, then I was sitting next to Greg Haddock, who became the head of the work in Canada, and he was translating for me. So then he translated, I can't remember what he translated it as, and then I smiled, and then our father said, and now even more so, this face of the rascal, maybe a rascal, something like that. So anyway, that was my first encounter. Then other personal encounters were one day when I was just walking up a stairs, and he came out of a door. So we walked up together. And then what he often did is he would take you by the arm with his arm in your arm. So you're kind of locking elbows. And he walked up, and he might grab onto your arm then too. And he said, "My son, I feel strong leaning on you." And I used that in the meditation recently, and I interpreted his comment as, on the one hand, he was then 60, and I was 22, so I was young and strong. So he could feel strong leaning on a young son of his. But also, I think he meant, I want to be able to lean on you. I think it was a way of giving a spiritual message. I need to be able to lean on you to do the work of Opus Dei. So that was another personal encounter. Then another one came when probably in my second year. So I arrived in, well, the end of 1962, which was the year I graduated in June from university. Then probably in 1963, I began to realize that a lot of the fellows that were studying there in the Roman College were going to be ordained priests. And normally when a person goes to Rome from Australia, for example, like we've had Father Phil and Father John Watson come back, and we'll get Father Sam Fancourt back, hopefully by the end of the year or whenever, then they go there and they're told beforehand, look, we'd like you to go to Rome, would you like to go? And in principle, would you be available? Would you be willing to be a priest? I haven't been privy to those conversations, but they would ask them that because we want to send you there, so maybe you can come back as a priest, because we need priests. But they never said anything like that when I went. So it was, I arrived there, and then you realize people are talking about priesthood and people are getting ordained. They were getting ordained in Spain, of course. And then, so I thought, well, if he wants me to be a priest, I'd be happy to be a priest too. So I mentioned that, and they said, well, what you do is you see him after a get-together, and you just tell him that you'd be willing to be a priest. So the next get-together, we're all in that same big lounge room, and what you do is there's only one door where he goes out, where he comes in, and you station yourself next to the door, and when he's about to go out, you say, Father, could I see you for a moment? And this is all in Spanish, of course. And then he said, sure. So then he took me out into a courtyard where we would never go. I don't know whether the door was locked, but it was a courtyard in the gardens of the villa that was generally off limits for us. And then I told him that I'd be willing to be a priest, and he said, very well. He was happy, and tell the rector of the Roman College, which I did. And then that was probably 1963. And then the time passed. When I finished in Rome in June of 1964, then they asked me, would you like to study canon law in Navarre? And the University of Navarre had started, I think it was 52, and this was now 64, and the canon law faculty was very good. So I agreed to do that. It was fine. So we went off to Pamplona and then studied canon law there. And then it was in 1967, around Easter time, so around April, they came and asked, are you still willing to be a priest? And I said, yes, of course. And they said, well, you can be ordained this year. So all of the final preparations for priesthood took place between about June, when I finished the canon law thesis, and between June and August. I was ordained August 27th. So all that was quick. But that was one encounter. But in that encounter, telling him I was willing to be a priest, it was about 20 minutes that we walked up and down in that courtyard. And again, he probably had me arm in arm, which he did. And so I told him this. But then the one thing I can remember from that conversation was he had been talking a lot in those years and on that day about freedom. And freedom in various aspects, like freedom to follow your vocation, to live it in whichever way you want. But there's many ways to be in Opus Dei. I mean, in your own vocation, of course. But he said, look, it's a wide road. You can go on the left, you can go on the right, you can go zigzag, you can go walking, you can go crawling, but stay on the road. So freedom to live your vocation, to have whatever particular areas of struggle, whatever spiritual reading you find helpful, whatever maybe personal devotions you've had in the past, keep on living them. Whatever walk of life you want to go into in regards to your profession, freedom, but stay on the road. There was that freedom. There was political freedom, because at that time, just the beginning of the 60s, Franco in Spain was asking certain members of Opus Dei to be in his cabinet. And you had some of the most Europeanizing ministers, like Minister for Finance, or there's one for the Common Market, whatever they called it at the time. And so people were now beginning to murmur in Spain that Opus Dei was allied with Franco. And Opus Dei had no political agenda. And St. Josemaría was just insistent on that. We have no political agenda. And you read in various books that I've read, written by members of the work who are involved in public life and in politics, saying that when they ever saw St. Josemaría, he never asked them about their political views or what they were doing. And if they were in Franco's cabin, he didn't ask them about that. He wanted them to do their professional work well, because it's working for God. So there was the whole idea of political freedom, which was a big issue at the time. And then just in general, freedom to follow your own way, whether you were in Opus Dei or not. But anyway, so he talked about that, and then he talked about people who were persecuting him. And there was the religious order that were very well known, very prestigious, and it was from their body, and not all of them, of course, but some of them were the ones that were leading the charge on him and on Opus Dei. And then he used a phrase from the Gospel that he had, I think he'd said it in the get-together, but he repeated it to me. And he said, they did it thinking they were doing a service to God. In other words, they were doing it with goodwill. They thought Opus Dei was inimical to the church, inimical to souls. They thought it was heretical to teach that you could be a saint in the middle of the world. So to attack Opus Dei, they were doing that because Opus Dei was not a good thing for the church. I mean, that's what they thought, some of them. And I've heard lots of stories in connection with that too. But anyway, so he was talking about how these good religious had attacked the church, potentes se obsequium, or potentes obsequium se prestare Deo, I think it was the Latin, thinking that they were doing a service to God. So that was another encounter. Then one of the things that made its way into the book that was presented to the Holy See for the opening of his cause, it was a book that we have, it's only in Spanish, I doubt if there's a copy here, but there might be, called The Articles of the Postulator. And it had the prima facie case for opening his cause of beatification and canonization. And then when he died, St. Josemaría in 1975, well, first of all, let me say something about that. That when my own father died of a heart attack in '56 when I was 16, I was saddened. But I think I felt more the death of St. Josemaría than I did the death of my own dad. He was very good, my dad. But I felt that the loss of a father who had showed me so much affection, which you can come to in different manifestations. But when I was in Rome in the second year, I must have lost a bit of weight. So when I went, I weighed about 80 kilos. And that there was a bit of muscle in that because I was doing a lot of sport, and I lost weight maybe because you weren't doing that much sport, so it could have been loss of muscle tone or whatever it was. And then he noticed that and he said, "My son, are you well? You have to eat more pasta." So he said that maybe a few times when I was in Rome. Then in June of 1964, when we finished our studies, a group of us went to Spain to go to the University of Navarre, or perhaps to other places too. And then he came to Pamplona often. For the University of Navarre, he was the Grand Chancellor, or the Chancellor, we would call him, in an Australian university setting. And he came there, and then there were big gatherings of the Friends of the University of Navarre, and other meetings, like the presentation of honorary doctorates. There was a ceremony like that practically every year, so he'd come for those. He came quite often to the university, and perhaps for medical checkups too. And then he would stay in RLR residence, where I was. That was the International Center of Studies. And so then you would see him there. And I can say this, every single time he saw me after I left Rome, he asked how I was. Yet he said, "You look thin." And then that went on. There were dozens of times when I saw him in Spain, and that was also in Madrid. And this would have been, I think, only after I was ordained in August. And then he asked it then. But one of the things that was a bit notorious and embarrassing was after I was ordained, he came to Madrid on his way to Pamplona, and we went. And that was the time that he gave that homily, Passionately Loving the World, which is the last chapter of the book, Conversations with Monsignor Escrivá. and where he talks about finding God in the middle of the world. It's a beautiful homily. And there were 30,000 people in that Mass, and George Minns was one of the ones that was in that Mass as well. I think someone else who is here now. And it was a beautiful sunny day, and it's not often sunny in Pamplona in October, but it was quite warm, and then open air Mass. And so I went up to that Mass from Madrid. But in the first time we were in a get-together in Diego de Leon, which was the headquarters of the work in Spain, and he saw me there. I was sitting on the floor, and I was dressed in my soutane. And then, so he called me up to sit beside him. And throughout the get-together, he was whispering things in my ear. He was putting his arm around me. He was just showing a lot of affection. And that he showed to other people too, but on that occasion, it was my turn. And it was so notorious that the following day we had another get-together, and Don Florencio Sanchez Bello, who was the counselor or the vicar of Opus Dei in Spain at that time for a long time, when the get-together came and I came in, Don Florencio says, "Look, sit way in the back where he can't see you." So I was the recipient of a lot of affection. And then another personal time was when I came to Australia. So I was ordained in August of '67, having finished the thesis. They wanted to publish it by the University of Navarre as a book, so I had to get that ready for publication. There was some work to be done on that. And then, well, let's go back to how I happened to come here. And that was that I was ordained in '67. I was writing to him, as we did occasionally, and suggesting I felt free to go anywhere in the world. So I didn't need to go back to the States. I could go anywhere he wanted me, and I said that. And I suggested the Philippines because I knew Bernie Villegas and Jesse Stanislao and Placido Mapa were three Filipinos that had studied at Harvard when I was there. They all did doctorates in economics, and they went back to start the work in the Philippines in 1964, and it took off like a house of fire, as you can imagine, in that Catholic country. And so then I was suggesting the Philippines, but then it was probably October of 1967 that one of the directors of the work in Spain came to me and said, "Look, the Father has asked, would you like to go to Australia?" And I immediately say, yes. I didn't hesitate half a second. And then they said, wait a second, just think about this, because that's not around the corner. It's not going back to the States. Pray about it, think about it. You have to be free about this and let us know. So I prayed about it a bit, and then the following day I confirmed. So then things were set in train. They informed him that I'd be willing to come. And the reason I was coming here was that we're talking now 1967, and the process of getting Warrain underway was there was the negotiations with the university and plans being drawn with the architects, and they needed a young English-speaking priest. So I was the nominee, young English-speaking priest. I had to learn Australian, but I'll tell you what, I had to get rid of my Spanish as well. And I would say it took me about 2 years to get rid of Spanishisms. Because when you're in Spain, I was in the Spanish-speaking environment in Rome. The Roman college, we spoke Spanish. And that was 2 years. And then in Spain, it was 3.5. So you're thinking and speaking in that language. And when you come back to your original language, your mind is still ticking over a little bit in Spanish, and you come up with Spanishisms. So I had to take about 2 years to purify my language of that. So anyway, then I started going through all the visa procedures, and it was very quick in those days, much quicker than it is today. So I had my visa by the end of January, and then I went through Rome. And then I can't remember where I was living, possibly in the Rui, the residence, international residence. But I went to Villa Teverde in the hope that I would see him, and he was quite happy to see me as well. But I was in a couple of get-togethers with him then, and one of them was with the general council in the room that they met in Villa Teverde. And it was an outstanding get-together. He was talking a lot about the history of the work, and I remember walking into it, and he was saying how much, no, that wasn't then. It was in '73 when we went for UNIF. He said how much we prayed for Australia because we were having those initial difficulties in Warrain. But of the get-togethers I was with him, there was this one with the General Council, and he was telling a lot about the history of the work and his own experiences there, and I took some notes afterwards. And then, but the best one was, it was my last day in Rome before I came, and I got word through they sent word that I was there to come up, and it was in the architect's studio, where the architects work, where Father Frank worked quite a bit when he was still a layman living in Villa Teverde. And in that get-together, there were no more than about half a dozen people. So it was Don Alvaro, Don Javier was there, and he would go in and out getting things, and our father would say, send along those ashtrays from Molino Viejo or whatever it was. So we'd get that, and then send along this or that for Australia. And then there were a couple of the architects, and another priest of the work perhaps was there. But it went on for an hour and a half, that one. And he said a lot. And again, I took notes afterwards, and I've used them sometimes in get-togethers. But it was very, very interesting, that get-together. And normally, they were never that long. And at one point, he said, we really must be going, but I'm so happy here, let's just stay. And so, and then he was saying a lot about Australia and how well they were doing here, and he was very fond of the work. It started in '63, and this was the beginning of '68. And then at the end, he stood up with Don Alvaro was there, and they both gave me the blessing. And it was probably the blessing for the trip as well. Although the following day I had another 20 minutes with him on my own. But so they gave me that joint blessing, and then he turned very abruptly and left. Now, he would have given me a hug and kisses, he always did that. But it was so abrupt that it was in some way disconcerting. And then I learned later that sometimes he did that in order not to get moved, because he was affectionate and he had a heart, and he didn't want to get too moved. So he just went quickly away so it didn't display any undue affection. But anyway, that was the day before I left, and then maybe 2 days before. But the following day, I was there in Villa Teverde again, and then I was invited up. And this time it was only he and I in one of those rooms in Villa Teverde where they worked. And it was 20 minutes alone. And he was asking me things like, was my mother happy with my vocation? I said, very happy. And then he said, well, I'll offer the Mass for her. Because at that time, he was celebrating Mass late in the morning. And what other things? Remember, one of the things, I wrote a lot of it down later, and I can go back to it and get the notes. But one of the things he said was, if you're ever hearing confessions or you're talking with a woman and she wants to get into too much detail in matters of the Sixth Commandment, just tell her to stop it, because you don't want to get into that area, especially as a young priest, and just ask an older priest or send her to an older priest. He said, that's what I did when I was your age. And then he was talking about sincerity. So it was the father giving advice to his young son going away to a far-off land. And what does the father want to communicate to his young priest son? One of them was sincerity. He said, be sincere. It's what most concerns me. If we are sincere, there is no problem that doesn't have a solution. So I never had any dangers of not being sincere, but that was the kind of the parting advice at the end of that. Then he gave me a get-together, and then I was off to Australia. And it was then, I think, that he said, and write to me when you've put on a few kilos, because again, he would always have talked about my weight. Write to me when you put on a few kilos. Well, that was '68. Then we started the work here, and I wrote to him quite a few letters, and I had 2 replies. Now, normally numeraries don't get replies from the father. He's got too many of them, too many numerary sons, but he can't answer them all. But he did answer 2 of my letters, and I had the copies there, but when he died, and all his writings had to be sent back to Rome, so the originals went back, but I had photocopies, which I still have. They're just fairly short, like half an A4, and he signed them Mariano. And he was talking to me, but to all of his sons in Australia, and just encouraging us in our work. Very nice letters. And then in '73, we took the first UNIV group of young Australians to Rome for the UNIV conference in Holy Week. And we went through Paris. I remember we had no clue about how you might have jet lag. That wasn't the factor. You arrive in Paris, and then you have a full day the next day. And anyway, and then we arrived in Rome for the UNIV, and Charles Burfitt asked the first question ever by an Australian in UNIV, and it was about something to do with Warrain, I think. And then our father took advantage of it to express his joy that we were there, these Australians, and he mentioned how we started with Warrain, and he said, normally when we start in a new region, we start with just a center of the numerals. Then we might put a small residence, and after that we might put a big residence. But in your case, because of the circumstances and Cardinal Gilroy's invitation to start a big residence, we started differently. And he said, and now I understand you're having some financial difficulties, and it makes me very happy. I still remember this. You're having financial difficulties, and it makes me very happy. Because he knew what financial difficulties were, and we've had any number of them since, because you're always having more expenses than you have income coming in. But it forces you to go out and ask for money. It forces you to pray more and be more resourceful with how you use the money you've got. So there was that. Then that was the big get-together with the students, which now they have in Cababianca. There's far more that go on. All of the students in the general get-together were in Villa Teverde, and that would be a few hundred. And then on the last day, so Easter Sunday comes, then Easter Monday, most of the groups had left. But we had another get-together with him, and maybe a few other national groups were there. And it was a very more intimate get-together, people asking him questions and he answering them. And then I was sitting there on the floor, and maybe towards the end of the get-together, he invited me to come up, and he gave me a huge hug, and he said, for all the Australians. This was his affection for Australia and for all the Australians. And I asked later, some years ago, whether they had taken a photograph of that, because it was so symbolic of our father's love for us. That wasn't me, it was all of us. So that was the last time I saw him. Now, other things of our father, and here we can take whatever questions people have. Somebody asked me, here, I'll answer one that somebody asked me today. Did I ever think when I was in Rome that I would see him canonized? Answer, absolutely not. Did I think he was a saint? Absolutely. I mean, he just exuded love for God and love for his fellow man. And actually, I didn't conclude something I was talking about. Every time he saw me, he asked me how I was because I looked thin. Well, I wrote that for in my testimony of him after he died, and then they used it in that Articles of the Postulator for the cause of beatification and canonization. But did I ever think I would see him canonized? And it just never dawned on me. And the reason was that you knew of the church canonizing people, but they were always people from centuries before, someone you'd never heard of. So they weren't going to canonize somebody that I knew personally. It just didn't figure in your radar. And then, of course, when he was beatified in '92 and canonized in 2002, I was there with great joy. And but he did insist. He says, we have to be saints, saints for the altars, canonizable saints. If not, we have failed. But that, too, meant little to me. I have to say this, because canonizable saint, what does that mean? And it was when I read the Articles of the Postulator that I began to realize this is serious, because they go through all the virtues. So the key thing of the church's judgment on sanctity is the judgment of heroic virtues. And they go through them one by one. Faith, hope, charity, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Related virtues like humility and chastity, of course, is part of temperance. and then show how in each one of these you live them to a quite extraordinary or exceptional degree. Now, some more than others, of course. But that is what canonizable sanctity meant. Not just you were a good person, you loved God, but you were living virtues to a heroic degree. Now, when we talk about being saints, that's what we're talking about. But it is, as Pope Francis writes in Gaudete et Exsultate, also saints for ordinary people, the saints next door, or what he calls the middle class of holiness. And that phrase, the middle class of holiness, is taken, when you look at the footnote, from the title of a book in French, and it's something like Les classes moyennes de la sainteté, something like that. The middle class of holiness. But it's really what it means is sanctity for the middle classes, for the average people. But the average people can be saints, as we see now with Guadalupe. So I didn't think I would ever see him canonized, and now, of course, we have. And he was a great saint. And then Don Alvaro was a great saint. And frankly, I think they're looking at getting testimonies about Don Javier. But Don Javier was in that mold as well. They were all so exceptional. Yeah, they weren't just good priests, they were exceptional. No, somebody asked the question.
Did you ever find out, Father, whether they photographed the hug?
They asked, and I think, yes, we found out that they didn't. Or they didn't have one. Yeah, it would have been so symbolic.
It would. It would. Thank you for that. That was fantastic. Wonderful.
Did he understand any English? Or?
Not really. I don't think so. In those days, everyone spoke Spanish there. He certainly spoke Italian. He would use phrases in Italian. And, of course, he was in Rome. Well, he went in 46 and then permanently from 1950, as we were hearing in the reading. And when you're in Italy that long and you're dealing with cardinals and popes and others, it's all in Italian. So, of course, everybody working in the General Council would learn Italian. And what I did was, well, what did we have in Italian? We had the telegiornale. There was the news on the Rai television. So television was in Italian. We had films very often, just because we're studying, all of us were studying in Villa Tevere itself. We weren't going out to the pontifical universities from that year on. Our father had more confidence in his own sons who had studied in the pontifical universities, teaching us really solid in theology in depth in a Thomistic way. So we studied in-house, and therefore to have just a bit of relaxation, we had films. And one of our brothers, a priest brother, was on I think it was either the Vatican or the Italian Catholic censorship board, so he had to watch films, and some of the ones he wouldn't want to see. But anyway, he could get films for nothing. So it wasn't every weekend, but often we would have a film. And so these were in Italian. And were there any subtitles? Probably not. And then the newspaper was in Italian. That was the Il Tempo we got. And this is interesting. I think we had one copy of that paper. And there's about 120 fellows in the Roman College wanting to read the one copy. So how did you do that? And there wasn't much time. So when the paper came, whenever we read it, it was after breakfast or whenever, it would get divided into all the separate sheets of paper. And what you'd have would be somebody holding it up and probably two people reading it on this side and two people reading it on the other side, if there was anything of interest. So then anyway, when you're in that Italian environment, you didn't really need to learn Italian, but you could get some sense of it from the Spanish. So I decided in the second year, I want to learn Italian. So I bought a book, or I got a book out of the library and just studied it on my own. It's been very, very helpful ever since.
Did he have a good sense of humor, Father?
Our father had an extraordinary sense of humor. He loved jokes. One of the Italians told jokes. He was really funny, and our father would roar with laughter at these jokes. And then he would joke about things too, like he wanted us to have a good time. So when I was there was a grand piano, but you may have read in the biographies of our father that he wanted us to have musical instruments like that. And so at that stage we had a piano. But when they started, they would be raising money for a piano. They were trying to pay off the buildings, and you know the strife that they went through, building buildings with that quality and size when they had no money. So fundraising was always a problem. So they would get a bit of money, and they think, well, now we can buy the young fellows a piano, but then they had to use it for food because there wasn't enough food. Or, for example, cigarettes. Everybody smoked in those days, and I didn't smoke. Or when people ask me, Father, did you ever smoke? I said, well, actually I did, but I gave it up when I was 8. And that's probably about right, because we would steal our mother's cigarettes and go out into the bush and puff on cigarettes, not inhaling. And but everybody in Europe smoked. It was the
Josemaría smoked?
He didn't, but this is something you may have read as well, that the first 3 priests, all civil engineers, and that was the highest degree you could do. It wasn't medicine, whatever else is hard to get into, it was civil engineering. So they were ordained in 1944, and none of them smoked. And our father said, somebody's got to smoke, because people will think otherwise the priests of Opus Dei don't smoke. So he asked Alvaro, would you like to take up smoking? so John Alvaro smoked, and in the get-togethers with him, he would be sitting in the back row, and he had his trademark cigarette holder. But he would be smoking quietly and paying attention. And now, I think you asked a question that I didn't answer.
No, that was fine. It was only about the humour.
Yeah, the good humor, yes, yeah, the good humor. So he wanted us to have pianos, and then I played the trombone. So he loved to hear the trombone, but of the music that's easier to play, it's blues, something a bit more dreamy, like Summertime and things like that. And but he liked upbeat music. He liked fast. That was just his style. But he liked joking. He was a great man of good humor. And as he said, I leave you my legacy, love for freedom and good humor. And that's what God had endowed him with, was good humor. How are we doing for time? Well, we're a little bit past the examination time. But Chris isn't here to hound us on our way. So anything else we can talk about?
How did you get into Opus Dei, Father?
Oh, that's another whole get-together. It's a circuitous route. When I talk about my vocation, it's a very interesting story, because it wasn't just one thing. It was a whole series of things. But let's leave that for another occasion, because it can be a long story, and even in its shorter version, it's probably more time than we have.
Did you put on weight, Father?
Oh yes, did I put on weight? So I didn't for a long time, but I was in. We lived in Creston for 2 years. We moved into Warrain on August 15th, 1970, and then there was a story about moving into Warrain because the place wasn't really ready. The lounge room was packed high with furniture for the bedrooms. There was no running water, except there was one room that had a shower, but it didn't have a shower head, and it had just the pipe coming out of water about chest high, and there was no hot water. So the showers that we took, the members of the work could take a shower there, and it was August, so it was freezing cold, and then the water just came out with this torrent straight at you, not filtered by a shower head. So that was a bit daunting. But and then there were guard dogs downstairs at night, I think, to if anybody broke in to try to steal anything. But so then I was in Warrain until the end of '91. Then we went to Hobart, and I didn't put on any weight in Hobart. And then I went to Melbourne for 4 years and didn't put on any weight in Melbourne. Then when I came back, I was now in my 60s, and when you get to be that age, you start to put on weight willy-nilly, so I put on a bit of weight. And then I wrote at that time, it was Don Javier, and I said, I'm fulfilling a request of our Father to write when I had put on a few kilos. I'm happy to say I put on a few kilos. So that was about 30-odd years later.
Father, when Alvaro came out to Australia and he visited Finlay and whatever, did you get the opportunity to reminisce with him about the founder, and did you talk to?
Not so much,
John?
no. It was always get-togethers, but people asked him questions, and it was phenomenal, Don Alvaro. And the thing about Don Alvaro, who those who saw him, was anybody here then in the work and saw him at the Clancy Auditorium, especially? What struck you about Don Alvaro at that stage was he was so peaceful. He was so grandfatherly, so loving, softly spoken, and under that facade, to call it that, of kindness, gentility, peacefulness, he was tough. Don Alvaro was very, very tough, and you read that in the history of the work. The things that he was asked to do, the things that he did during the war, he had an exceptional willpower, fortitude, toughness. He was exceptional. But that remained, obviously. He wasn't going to lose that when he got older. But he had that great sense of peace and serenity. And one of the things, for example, that Father Masso was telling, they were driving to the car, to the Clancy Auditorium, in the car to the Clancy Auditorium for the big get-together. There would be 1,000 people there. And Father John was worried about anything that could go wrong, and so much could go wrong. One thing that did go wrong, some of the sound systems didn't work. Most of them did. Or someone might ask an embarrassing question. Somebody might come in that wasn't expected to be there. Well, nothing went wrong. But Don Alvaro put Father John Masso at ease. He said, don't worry. There's so many people praying for us. Everything will go very well. And that was Don Alvaro. But the get-togethers were always in a group, and he was answering them. So I didn't have any personal encounters with Don Alvaro then. So why don't we finish there?
Thank you, Father.
And
Thank you.
Brilliant.
so that's personal encounters with the saint, and that leaves its mark, hopefully. I mean, I've got to answer for it, so you can't help but live with him that close for 2 years. That's another thing. Father Jerry was in Rome for the 2 years before I was. I asked him once, how often did you see our father? And they were living in Villa Tevere like we were. He said, about 3 or 4 times a month. Well, in my time, it was 3 or 4 times a week. And the reason was that the Second Vatican Council began, I think it was the 11th of October, and I arrived in Rome, as I said, on the 1st of October of '62. And then 10 days later, the Second Vatican Council begins. Don Alvaro was working behind the scenes in the council, and he just was always there in the Vatican. So our father had more time to be with the students. So the bell would ring in the morning when we were about to go to class, or maybe just starting a class, announcing that he was having a get-together, generally in the morning after breakfast. So then we had 3 or 4 times a week. That's my recollection, and that went on for the 2 years that I was there. So lots of get-togethers.
Wow.
So anyway, let's go to the examination. Chris might have given up on us. Now, Michael and
hospital with,
I was just going to ask.
Fantastic. Well, that's it.
so they've taken him to Hawkesbury.